for attending our program today. My name is Erin Payton, and I am the Executive Director of the 19th Century Charitable Association, which is located in Oak Park, Illinois. We're so happy to have you at today's program, Fading Ads of Chicago. Before we start the program, I just want to let you know a few things. If you have some questions that bubble up during the presentation, you can leave them in our Q&A field or in the comment section. And what we do is if we have time at the end, we'll open up for questions from the audience. And I will go to your question. I'll say, oh, would you like to ask a question? I'll say your name. I unmute you and you can ask the question yourself. So it's like you're right here at the program. Otherwise, just sit back and relax and enjoy the program. And now I'm going to welcome the Literature Chair for the 19th Century Charitable Association, Deb Hammond, to tell us a little bit more about today's program.
Hi, Erin. It's great to be here for the first program of the Literature Committee this year, and it's our first experience doing Zoom. We're very, very pleased to start off with a great program today. We've got Joseph Marlin here, and he is an author. He's also a collector. He collects vintage cameras from the Chicago photographic industry, still cameras, movie cameras, street cameras, Art Deco items, and photos of vintage signs. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. He's a member of the Chicago Art Deco Society, and he's a board member of the Hyde Park Historical Society, and he's lived more than 50 years in his 100-year-old semi-detached row house. He started documenting Chicago's outdoor advertising signs more than 30 years ago. Now, many of them are gone, and we can't see them except we got his photos, and we're going to look at them today. His 3 decades of photo collection offers the last glimpse of a bygone era of advertising, commerce, and Chicago. It includes small shops and it includes national brands. So there's a variety of the different things. The post-Chicago fire brick walls made a perfect canvas for the artists to give us these little tidbits of history. They used artistic experimentation, commercial endeavor, and there's signs for all different types of businesses. So we're very pleased to welcome Joseph Marlin virtually to the 19th Century Club.
Hello, I'm Joe Marlin. I want to thank you, Deb, for your very generous introduction, and I want to thank the 19th Century Charitable Association for inviting me. And I think you're all going to enjoy the presentation because I've done this program 8 or 10 times before a live group pre-COVID, and once before on Zoom, and people have always enjoyed it because it's like a nostalgia trip in part. The title of my talk is Fading Ads of Chicago, and I'm going to bring up one fading ad, but first I'm going to spend a few minutes telling you what they are, where they are, how they came about, and things like that, and then we'll show the pictures, and I'll talk about the slides. There are about 32 of them. Some I'll talk about very briefly and some in more detail. This is one example of a fading ad, and I'm going to leave it up for a while I do the presentation. Fading ads used to be called ghost signs. And most of them, but not all, were painted on the side walls of brick buildings. They were painted there, obviously at right angles to where people would walk down the sidewalk, ride their horse and buggy down the street, or maybe their two-cylinder car. Obviously, as an advertisement, it was of no use unless it could be seen. So smaller ads were closer to the street, usually at the first or second floor level, but there could be very big ads if there was a very big expanse of brick, such as a side wall of a warehouse, so that you could have ads 10 or 20 feet tall and 30 or 40 feet or more wide. The heyday of these ads was from about 1890 to 1930. After that, they diminished because it got too costly. The cost of labor, that was labor intensive to paint them. It cost a lot for supplies. And they were replaced by and large by billboards. Although billboards had been contemporaneous with painted wall ads back in the 1890s and early 1900s and going forward. In fact, in Chicago and other cities, the city fathers found there were so many billboards and painted ads that it felt it did not present a beautiful picture of the city that they wanted, but they found that they weren't able to do much about it because it was all part of private enterprise. Someone who wanted an ad up, unless you owned the building yourself, would have to contract with the owner of the building and then hire someone to do the work. The people who painted these, usually if they were smaller ads, were an individual or a partnership of two painters. But bigger ads that would be up 5 or 6 stories high and across the big wall were usually painted by major sign companies, some national and international in scope, that did all kinds of signs, of which painted walls were just one type, would paint them. And they would present the painters with a template, maybe a foot high and 3 feet wide, showing the contents and if there was a design or graphics and what colors they wanted. And it would be the job of the painter to blow these up proportionately so that it would look 20 or 30 or 50 or 1,000 times larger than what they had in hand. So the people who did the painting would be considered commercial artists and not fine artists. These wall ads were not dated, and rarely did they even have the name of the company. Only when it was a major sign company would you have something underneath indicating a name. So there's always a question of how do you date these? There are different ways of telling. When was the product made? If a phone number was given, and that would only be the case usually of local stores or companies, you could tell by how many, you could tell something at least by how many digits there were after the exchange. Or you could tell by the style of lettering. Or you could take an educated guess as to which decade. So in my book, and in most of the books, because my publisher, the History Press, has published 6 books called Fading Ads of, which Chicago is one, Cincinnati, New York, and 3 other cities are the other ones they've done. People usually indicate circa 1910, circa 1920, because that's about the best that you can do. When I talk more about this particular ad in front of you, we can actually be more specific, and I'll tell you why. Now, you may ask, well, where did these ads appear? And in the United States, they were universal. They were in big cities. They were in Manhattan and Brooklyn and Chicago and any older parts of cities, so that cities that are now large but are relatively new, say a Houston or LA, wouldn't have these signs at all to the degree that you would find, say, on the East Coast or Midwest. Many of these, the painters who painted these, let me put it this way, were referred to as wall dogs. Nobody knows why. But in the North, of course, it was seasonal work. They couldn't paint in the wintertime. They couldn't paint when it was raining. They couldn't paint when the wind was blowing too hard, particularly if they were on a scaffold on a very large size painting. But you would find these ads in medium-sized towns, as I mentioned, in the metropolises. You would find them in small towns whenever there was a brick wall. But the other thing that made them last is the side walls of buildings in Chicago and elsewhere were generally made of less expensive brick than the front. In the front, if it was a store or a department store or something, there would generally be windows to let light in. There would be fancier brick or terracotta or maybe glazed brick, so you wouldn't have a surface to paint on. But the side walls in Chicago, it was made of what was called Chicago brick, and it was softer, and they used lead paint. And the lead paint leached into the softer brick. So when the surface deteriorated from the weather and the freezing and the thawing and the coating of paint disappeared from the surface, there was still paint left in the brick. And it's particularly when it got rained on, it would glow a bit, and that's why these were called ghost signs. But the term fading ads is a little more generic because you could paint on stone, you could paint on metal, you could paint on wood, so that, and all of them would fade in time. So fading ads is a more generic term. A lot of these ads reappear when a building next door is torn down. I don't believe in this case that was really, in this one that you're looking at, Dayton Royal Tourist, that was the case. But some you will see very much evidence of a building being torn down, and then suddenly an ad appears. And that will happen 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 50 years from now. One of these signs may reappear that's been hidden for essentially a century. But that's not that common. And occasionally when it shows up, there's mention of it in the newspapers because it's such a startling event. What did these signs advertise? Well, they could advertise very local stores or local products. They could advertise national products. They advertise services, businesses, anything that could be advertised could be put up on the wall. The heyday, as I believe I mentioned, was from about 1890 to 1910. I became interested in this because I was always interested in photography. And I worked starting about 1980 on the west side at Mount Sinai Hospital. And I saw a lot of these on old brick buildings on the near southwest side. And then I began, as I drove around Chicago, I would make a list. I would see other ones and I would make a list and go around usually on Sunday mornings when there was less traffic. My regret is that I did more systematically at the time, beginning about 1980, and some of these pictures date from 1980 to 1985 and thereafter, that I did not more systematically go around Chicago to look at what might be there, because there must have been thousands and thousands of this type of advertising at that time, most of which are gone. There's very little that you will see in these pictures today that is still up on walls because they've either entirely faded out, the buildings have been torn down, another building is put up next to it, or to my surprise, some of them disappeared because buildings were rehabilitated, walls were tuck pointed and cleaned up. Ipso facto, no more sign. So let's go now. I've talked enough, I think, about looking at some of these signs. This one is for Dayton Royal Tourist. That may not be immediately apparent what it was advertising. At the top, barely visible, is the name Stoddard. Stoddard was the family, a father and son, and they made very high-priced automobiles that would be equivalent to top-of-the-line Mercedes today, automobiles that this particular model, which was the full works two-seater, seating 4 or 5 people, would have cost the equivalent of $100,000 today. But as I mentioned, this one you can date because the company made cars only from 1908 to 1913. This ad was found a little bit north of the automobile landmark district in Chicago, which starts at Cermak Road, 22nd Street, and goes south on Michigan to 26th and through some parts of it on adjoining streets, east and west. But there were many supporting businesses and showrooms north of the official automobile row. This ad was about 15th in Michigan, no longer exists. The car was very expensive. They made dozens of models. They apparently priced themselves out of business. Now we'll go on to the next one. This is another ad nearby on, I believe, Indiana Avenue, a block or two from the one you just saw, advertising runabouts and touring cars. $500 to $1,250, I believe it reads. The wording at the top is virtually impossible to read, but obviously this was not for the Dayton Royal Tourist because it was a less expensive car, but again, a touring car would have been seated 4 or 5, whereas a runabout would be more like a coupe with probably 1 seat for 2 people, or possibly a rumble seat. Now, yellow cabs you will recognize because that company still exists. And it was founded by someone whose name you would know if you saw it. Founded in 1907, and the founder's name is on trucks that appear on Chicago streets and streets all over the country every day. A man named John Hertz, H-E-R-T-Z. He and a partner started the Yellow Cab Company in Chicago, and it became the largest cab company in the world. And at a time when all cars were black, he made yellow cars so they would be more visible on the street so people could hail them. But about the time of the Depression in 1929, he and his partner decided to go into the rental business. And I don't know if it was called Hertz at that time, but the Hertzes are now a big rental truck company. Now, this first group has to do with transportation. So the first were cars and cabs. This is Horseshoer. This is Thomas McHugh. Horseshoer with a phone number, Blue 4971, 4 digits. That would mean that this was put up after 1920. If it was 3, it would be before 1920. And there are still horseshoers. So horseshoeing is not out of date, but you would not expect to see advertisements for horseshoers in the middle of the city. This one, in fact, was put up only about 1.5 miles from my house in the 4300 block of South Cottage Grove Avenue. So there's no need for horseshoers in residential neighborhoods anymore. Here's another ad. Now, this is much newer. This is probably late 30s or maybe immediately post-World War II. This was on Irving Park Road, west of Kedzie in Chicago. All of these, of course, are in Chicago, with one or two exceptions. Wester Auto something. It was an automobile parts and repair store advertising Apex batteries. But if you notice the man with the cap, that was a kind of uniform of service attendants at filling stations in the 1930s and for a little while after World War II, which dates it. And then there's some more wording downstairs and some zigzag lightning signs for the electric power of the battery on the lower left. Now we're getting into some foods. Here is one, Marigold Margarine, for the building it's on. And Marigold was the leading advertiser for margarine in the 1920s and 30s. I don't know. This is probably from the late 20s, early 30s, etc. They did a lot of advertising in newspapers and magazines of a boy pointing with his dog, a very attentive dog, because they know quality, and showing a package of their oleomargarine, as it used to be called. This was interesting because a friend of mine who actually did a master's degree on ghost signs for her degree at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago called me up, knew and had seen some of my slides, called me up to tell me at 5200 North Milwaukee there was this wonderful sign. So I went up there, and a man on an enormous Caterpillar earth-moving machine was leveling the ground behind fencing. And he stopped his machine and invited me in, telling me I could get a better picture if I came inside the fencing rather than stood outside, which was rather remarkable. But nowadays you can only see half of this sign, because once a building was down, guess what happened? They put up a condo. So right north, up and down through right where the I is in Marigold, and between the G and the A in margarine, that's where the front of the building is, and you only see now the first half of the sign, which looks very peculiar indeed. But it stayed in such good shape relatively with the gold and the blues, because obviously it had been sealed in. And they did some repair up above too, but it basically had been sealed in for probably, this was taken, maybe 20 years, 15 years ago or so. So it probably was sealed up for quite a number of decades. And here's another sign for food for Blue Label Ketchup. This was located, again, long gone, in the 7200 block South Stony Island Avenue, not so far from where I live in Hyde Park. And it was a major advertiser at that time. It was not a Chicago company. They were located in Rochester, New York. But they had a lot of advertising slogans, and they had their writers kept busy. And one of them said, and I quote, "Pure and unadulterated, containing only those substances recognized and endorsed by the U.S. government." I don't think you'll find an ad worded like that today. And there's some other smaller things that says from and tomatoes and things like that. And on the left, at the bottom, again, there's an ad that's not for the ketchup, but often you will find several ads on one wall, and sometimes you will find remains of 2 or more ads, because sometimes they actually painted over the painted ad, just like you would put a new ad up on a billboard with paper. Sometimes you would paint over these. The advantage of the painted ads is if you had a store or business that you expected to last for a while, you wouldn't need to keep putting up new ads on billboards, which would only last for so long, because these would last a long time. But I don't think anybody expected them to last 75 or 100 years. Now here's one for Aunt Jemima pancake flour. This was in the 92, about 9200 South Chicago Avenue on the far southeast side of Chicago. I understand there's some question now about renaming this ad because it stereotyped an overweight African-American woman who was cooking. But Aunt Jemima has a Chicago connection. Now I believe it's made by one division of the Quaker Oats company. But the original Aunt Jemima was born a slave, and in 1893, probably was a child when she was in the slave family. In 1893, she appeared in person at the Chicago World's Fair on the Midway, no doubt making pancakes. And another Aunt Jemima appeared at the 1933 Chicago World's Fair. So this is one example of an old brand started in the 1880s, still available in the grocery stores today. And here's a different kind of food for dogs, rival dog food. I have another picture of this. This is not existing, and another one I found around 1900 South Halsted that has the bottom half. You'll notice the bottom half is missing. It's been painted over. You see the top ears of the dog and the top of a can, but I kept it because I like the arf arf part. Nowadays, the ad might have some sound with it, but not this one. I don't believe rival dog food itself is on the market because canned dog food gave way to the dry dog food. And here's one for Quaker Oats. You can see the big Q. You can see it was covered up. You can see those holes in the wall where beams went across for the next building. There's some remains of an ad at the top where it looks like it's been tuck pointed again, and that is really faded out so that you can't really make out even what it is. But Quaker Oats was another very old product from the 1880s or 1890s, and but still very much present today. Now we're coming into drinks of different kinds, beers, whiskeys, and soft drinks, Gold Crown beer. Some of these ads like this, and for different products and services, you would find the same or almost identical ads in dozens of places in a big city like Chicago. That's true for this. I'll show you in a while ad for the Chicago Tribune. They had lots of ads. The Chicago Daily News had lots of ads. Coca-Cola had ads all over the city, and of course they had ads profusely in various media. But Coca-Cola is still with us. Started in 1888. Sold everywhere. Relieves fatigue. Up in the upper right, it said delicious and refreshing. Those phrases they still use, but relieves fatigue is not used because after all, the Coca-Cola was really based in part on a residue or whatever the right term is of the coca plant. So it was supposed to perk you up. But once the drug laws changed in 1906, they no longer, I believe that's my assumption, no longer use the phrase relieves fatigue. I once wrote to their archives, but never got an answer back about when they stopped using the phrase relieves fatigue. But I wanted to say a little bit more about the Coca-Cola. It started out in the 1880s, 1886, as a patent medicine. And like other patent medicines, it advertised that it cures all kinds of problems, including morphine addiction, indigestion, nerve disorders, headaches, and impotence. But by 1903, they started using spent coca leaves, and later they used none. And in 1913, I found out that they had spent $250,000 on wall ads alone. So they were a prolific advertiser, and as we know, they advertised in newspapers, in magazines, on walls, and of course, later in media of radio and television. And I recorded 5 or 6 Coke ads. This one was up, and you can see it had just reappeared on the scene because a pile of bricks from the building that was torn down is still right there in the middle of the picture. And it probably wasn't up there for very long. And something else is probably in its place, because when I looked at it, I couldn't find it again. Now we're going into stores. The Boston store. The Boston store was a big chain, Midwest chain. It started in Milwaukee in the very late 1800s. They were on State Street in what was referred to as Department Store Row. I found 2 or 3 signs for Boston stores because they were in neighborhood shopping centers where there were big intersections, and like there used to be Sears stores at big intersections, although Sears apparently never put up ads like this because I found no evidence of their doing that. And nor did I find, say, Marshall Fields or Carson's ever put up painted ads. But Lyon and Healy did, and that ad is still visible in the loop. There still are a few remaining in the loop where the building that they're on hasn't been torn down. Everything known in music, and they really meant it. And their building, which was no longer used for their store, really was an enormous emporium for anything related to music. They had separate floors where they would sell musical instruments, including antique ones. They would sell published music. They had studios for getting lessons. They sold records and phonographs and sheet music and on and on. But now their company near Washington and Ogden, they still make harps. They make the large harps that are used by most symphony orchestras in the world. So they're kind of just a kind of shadow of their former self. This is an ad, who knows, from the 20s or 30s, probably for contractors, because they sold all kinds of glasses, chipped Florentine ground things, skylight that individuals would not use, but they were probably a supplier for painters and decorators. This is an interesting ad with an interesting history. Now we're going into products. Gold Dust to Busy Cleaners. Gold Dust products for washing powder and soaps were the bestseller in their categories for about 60 years, from the 1880s to the 1940s, when they got supplanted by detergents, which had a different a different formula, and possibly also because they were still using this stereotyped African American children in their ads. That actually had names. They were called Goldie and Dusty. One did the washing, one did the drying, and one of their advertising slogans was "Let your twins do the work." And they advertised in several locations around the city. Now we're moving to a different type of product, the Undertaker. Now this is one that has the Hyde Park 663. This ad is still visible about 6500 South Cottage Grove Avenue. 663 means it had to be put up before 1920, so it was put up 100 or more years ago. Still, it's more faded out because, again, I might have taken this 20 or 25 years ago, but still visible. But Mr. O'Hanley, I'm sure, is no longer doing the undertaking. And this picture is on an apartment building. I did a number of these talks in the area where I live in Hyde Park, because I thought it was interesting lettering and still in good shape. But now it's still up there, but faded out 20 years later. But the facade of the building, actually, which I found out, it has a very fancy Spanish Revival terracotta and is listed in the National Register of Historic Places for their terracotta. Here's an ad I found on the west side. Again, it has an ad for pianos and the College of Music at the top, but for the Tribune, for the bottom 2/3, the Seventh-day Wonder of the World, the Sunday Tribune. They weren't modest, but just dated before, I think, Colonel McCormick, or maybe not, because he became the editor in 1910. And again, it's hard to date this, but probably from about that period. The Tribune was known for introducing Little Orphan Annie and for the radio station WGN, which stood for World's Greatest Newspaper. But not to be outdone, the Daily News, read and use, they advertise. But this, you don't see the read and use, but in some ads, there are about a dozen of them, or were around the city. The Daily News want ads. This was on the west side. It was one of the first papers to have a foreign news bureau, and they also had a radio station. Now we're going into clothing. I'm going to have to hurry up a bit. I see I want to leave some time for questioning. This was on the near west side. This is one of the oldest ads, probably late 1800s, very early 1900s, judging from the lettering styles. Collars and cuffs, when men could buy their shirts and then customize them with which kind of collar or what kind of collar or what kind of cuffs they wanted. You can see there was a building next door, because you can see the stairways going down. Apparently, they just used the same wall, or maybe because it doesn't look like there had been a separate brick wall there. The buildings were made a little differently then. Here's another one from even perhaps earlier, also advertising cuffs, and the Morris Clothing Company. There is a Morris Clothing Company now, but this is not the same one. And this was in a similar location. You used to be able to see both of the previous one and this one if you were driving towards downtown on the Stevenson Expressway, but they're long gone. And here's one that was in a loop, but is no more, for Seltz boots. And then the bottom part is behind behind the building that was to the right. It covered it up. boots and shoes. Sult's was a big manufacturer of boots and shoes from the late 1800s to the beginning of the Depression. Had various partners. Started out as a clothing store, then wholesale shoes, and then did manufacturing. And this is a sign that was visible of Bossard corsets. There were more ads for men's clothing in men's stores, very few for women. This was visible until recently, as well as another ad that was on ground level. This was up in this fifth rise building going up there. That's probably the last time I was down. It hadn't quite reached the level of corsets, but I wouldn't expect that it's still there anymore. And this is one of my favorites. Look for 121. 121 East Monroe, Misfit Clothing. So this is a place to go. If your one arm is a little longer than the other or one leg a little shorter, head right for there. Go there today at 120. You can see there was nicely gravelled off. They don't have the, right after something was torn down, but alas, it's no longer there. It was just north of downtown on LaSalle, not far south of Division Street. Now we're getting into patent medicine, a little bit off what was the Congress Expressway, now Ida Wells. Was this ad for Wizard Oil, one of the big sellers in patent medicines, cures neuralgia, rheumatism, and all other pains. So if you've got pains, try to find, maybe you can find an old used bottle of Wizard Oil and solve all your health problems. Just for your information, it started out being for rheumatic and muscle pain, but its contents were 50% alcohol, together with a little camphor, chloroform, sassafras, cloves, and turpentine. So if you have a yen for turpentine in the bottle and want to drink some, just get some Wizard Oil, and I'm sure all your needs will be met, and you'll be cured too. This kind of product was sold at county fairs. You know, there were the hucksters who would advertise it. But a famous author of yesteryear, an Indiana author named James Whitcomb Riley, who's little heard of anymore, was one of the early sellers of this product. Now we come to tobacco. Bull Durham, smoking tobacco on the market from before the Civil War until about 1888. Roll your own, from Durham, called Durham, from Durham, North Carolina. The standard of the world. And another ad at the bottom for oysters. Oysters were big in bars in Chicago a long time ago. And in the center, of course, there's a picture of the bull, and it refers to smoking tobacco. And they had a lot of ads around town, not all of them with the bull, but mostly. Here's another tobacco ad. I could not find the name of tobacco, but I found a picture in the New York fading ads book that this type of lettering was used by Mecca tobacco. It's hard to date, but probably from the 1920s. There were tobacco products were tried to elicit feelings, the romance of the Middle East, because the names of cigarettes in those days included Ramses, Sultan, Nazir, Salome, Pasha, and there's one tobacco on the market that still has the name from this era, Camel Cigarettes. Now, I mentioned that everything was on walls. This company was being torn down, and I'm just about ready to finish up, so there'll be some time for questions. the Handy Button Machine Company. You can see the building is a wreck. They didn't make buttons, they made machines that made the covering for buttons, and they still exist. I had the pleasure of talking with the great-grandson of the founder. It was founded in the very late 1800s and still exists, but at a much smaller scale than now. And here's an ad for Ad Lake, which is still visible on a building if you get off the Kennedy Expressway and go east at Ohio. At the top of the building, and in another place, you can see ads for Ad Lake, which stood for Adams, and Westlake, which made supplies for the railroad industry, were very big. Moved to Elkhart, Indiana in 1923. So their name on the building is now at least 100 years old and fast fading out. They also made, for a few years, cameras, and I have 3 or 4 models of Ad Lake cameras, which are big box cameras that they made for a short period of time. And here's one in the loop for Tides, Pelts, and Tallow, not far from the Lake Street L. I think I saw it on the Brown line, but of course that was Chicago Stockyards. And this one, I just want to call your attention to briefly. This is a Fuller. This is not a painted ad, but it's even rarer than the painted ads. It's a paper ad that was put up in 1903 and still visible in 1985, but it was, of course, covered up. They tore down the building. It was at Monroe and Wabash on the southwest corner, advertising a Filipino musical written by a humorist in Chicago newspapers named George Ade, whose name is little remembered anymore. And here's an ad, Pullman to St. Louis, and there were a lot of these type of ads on metal, on railroad overheads.
Hi, I just wanted to let everyone know that there is a button in our presentation that you can order the book in either hardback or paperback from the book table. They have a couple in stock, but they can order them and get them in 1 or 2 days. So if you're interested in getting this book with some of these great signs, we just saw 34 of them today. Joe, how many pictures of signs do you actually?
Oh, there are about 150 pictures, but some I have a blow the whole scene and just a blow up of some details. So if I counted individual ones, I only counted the ones. It's probably 140 different ones, and I've selected. I've made a selection of different categories, and I didn't want to, for purposes of showing these, I didn't want to show too many that were too faded out. There are some in the book, of course, it's called faded ads. So that's what you get when you take a picture. And I gave a few examples of some that are unrecognizable. But when I was taking the pictures, if it was really in such bad shape, I didn't even bother, There was no point in doing it. You couldn't make out what there were. All you could say is there was an ad here at one time, but now it's too bad a shape to even bother about it, so to speak.
I see. I was telling Joe that the Forest Park Review just had a picture of the sign that was on Calcagnos, just south of Madison Avenue. It just was in the paper last week, and it was Calcagnos advertising Dr. Pepper. And that's a sign I used to see from when I first started living in this area. Are all of your photos, Joe, from in the city?
Yeah, well, there's one, I took one in Berwyn and one in Evanston, like 2 blocks from the city limit. As I've taken trips, I've taken pictures of, as I've run across them from between New York and the West Coast, I've taken pictures. If you go to look at ghost signs and Google it, you can find all kinds of people who have taken, including one professional photographer whose who did artwork for Hollywood movies and has a whole big laboratory and complicated, expensive equipment. And he claims he's taken 7,000 signs.
Wow.
And he devoted his life to it. Then he blows them up, and he has specialized equipment. If you can't quite get to them right, he's got all kinds of specialized equipment to take pictures of them, and then he processes in the lab and sells big prints like 20 by 24 in art houses and so forth. So that's a whole different ball game than what I'm dealing with. I'm just an amateur. I was never in the advertising business. I am not a professional photographer. I was a clinical social worker by training. I retired from working as the director of social work at Mount Sinai Hospital on the west side of Chicago. So I did this just as a hobby and because I was interested, and I found a publisher at long last.
Well, that's great. Erin, do you have any questions from our audience?
I do. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to myself. I'm going to read a comment just because it's very interesting and detailed. Edmund McDevitt says, just a comment. 3 or 4 years ago, a graffiti artist got on top of the current Lion and Healy building, and on a facade that projects above the roof facing north, painted his tag name Harp, visible from the Green Line trains. I was amazed when Lion and Healy painted over it. So I guess that kind of goes with the opposite. So something that wasn't supposed to be there is painted over. Have you ever been interested, so I'm going to ask, in capturing graffiti?
No, I haven't. Although I have one picture in the book, which is actually one of my favorite, where I showed that smokestack with the handy button machine company. I had another picture, the building was being torn down. But somebody, the company had put up an ad, I don't have it right in front of me, about where you could go for the employment office. But somebody had painted over that, I think, as a joke, something to, how to get employed here. They were tearing the building down. It was like, how could you be employed if they were tearing it down? I would like to add that, I certainly support people buying the book at local bookstores, and I know it's sold pretty well at one of the major bookstores in Hyde Park near the university, where they have a lot of bookstores and they sell a lot of books. But it is available on Amazon. And if anybody is dying for an autographed copy, they could email me, but the email address at the back of the book, ironically, is not correct. So they could email me at joermarlin@aol.com, and I would be glad to make arrangements if anybody was interested, because I could make arrangements to autograph a book and mail it to them or whatever.
Awesome. Thanks, Joe. We have another question from Nan Brulette. I'm going to answer your first question, Nan. The book is called Fading Ads of Chicago, but you asked a couple of different questions. So why don't you pick one of your questions? I've unmuted you or asked you to unmute yourself.
Hello. That was a wonderful program, really interesting. Did you do anything besides pictures on walls, like the Burma Shave signs particularly?
In one word, no. I remember the Burma Shave signs from going on trips with my parents when I was younger, and they, of course, disappeared quite a number of years ago. I think there may be a small number left. I'm a member, but it was mentioned I'm a member of the Chicago Art Deco Society. There is a group called the Society for Commercial Archaeology, which has 500 or 600 or 700 members. They do not dig up anything, but they're interested in old travel routes like Route 66. They're interested in old advertising, more neon signs, early neon signs, but also wall signs and old structures associated with travel routes, like old old motel kinds of places in which the units were built like Indian teepees or something like that, or they're interested in old coffee shops in which the building looked like a big cup, or things, weird things along the road. So, so they're interested in things like neon signs and various things like that. But no, I just took pictures of walls. And one way I didn't mention that they disappear is they just get painted over. I found two of them. One I took it was an enormous wall, and it had 2 or 3 different ads on that faded at different times where they had been painted with different ads. And within a few days, painters were there painting the whole wall white. I found two examples of that. And awesome. I found one place, one of the Quaker, I think that's where I showed that Quaker Oats ad. Well, it may not be that one, but there was one on South Halsted where there was a Quaker Oats ad. I took a picture of it. The last time I went by, that wall was all cleaned up, and where the building had been that was torn down, revealing the ad, was a nice patio and outside seating area for the condo next door.
Yeah, glad you caught it. Meg Herman, I'm going to unmute you.
I was curious, at the very beginning, you were talking about some of the techniques used to paint on the bricks.
Yeah.
And how that worked in the various buildings. I was wondering, how does that compare to painting on sides of barns?
Well, I think basically, like, I remember when you used to see lots of ads for mail pouch tobacco on the sides of barns. That was a big advertiser. I never saw one, an ad. I've seen ads for cigarettes on side of brick walls, but mail pouch apparently never did that, or at least I've never saw any. I think they were catering to smaller town or rural users of their product. But I would suspect they were using the same lead paints and hiring the same painters to do those. So, and if I found one that was fading, I would have taken a picture of it. But that's about all I can say. I mean, because all paints until 1980s were, these outdoor paints were all lead-based paints anyway. And I suspect, they used what was available and what would last a while.
All right, thank you for that answer. This is from a shy attendee who wants me to ask the question. And you may have answered this. I apologize. I don't think you did, though. Did the artists who painted the ads on the walls use a pattern, or did they paint everything freehand?
Oh no, it would depend. If you were painting a big major ad for big products, and a company would say have their own advertising department. Say the Boston store, they would have an advertising department because they advertise in various media, magazines, but mostly newspapers because they were local, or a local magazine. And they would advertise on radio, I'm sure. But they would have a template. They would have a design on a big sheet of paper. It would indicate all the sizes, proportions. It would indicate the coloring, the style of lettering. Their art department would do that. It was the job of the wall dogs, of the painters, to duplicate that exactly proportionately. That was not easy to do because they had to know how to measure all that out, and there were curved lines, and often they had pictures too of people, or some caricature, or some kind of figures, or the logo of the company. So they had to duplicate all of that exactly. So they were not independently; they couldn't do their own thing. But they had to do a hard job very well, because if they made something misshapen that was not supposed to be that way, it might impair their being hired by somebody else who wouldn't want to use them, right? If they saw what the results were.
Awesome. Thanks. Good answer. We've got two more questions if you're up for them.
Go ahead.
Okay. Bonnie, you want to ask your question? Unmute yourself.
Oh, hi, Joe. Thanks for the talk.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, this is Bonnie. One of the last slides you showed was that it was called the Sultan of Zulu.
Yes,
and you were saying that it was very rare because it was made of something other than paint, and then the audio got fuzzy. What was it? Why was that one so rare? What was it made of?
No, it was paper.
Oh, paper.
It was a paper poster put up on the wall temporarily to announce a show that was playing at a Loop Theater that was going to be there probably a few weeks or a month or two or whatever. It was not meant to be there for any long-term stay. And then they put up a building and sealed it in. And it sealed it in so well that no water or freezing rain or anything got in there, because it probably sealed at the top or wall to wall. And it just preserved it, and it was in remarkable condition. So, and it was put up as the musical was dated 1903, and they tore down the building in 1985. So that was 82 years, and there it was in really remarkably good condition. So you rarely find, obviously, if the building hadn't been put up, the weather would have, taken it down in a matter of probably a few months or something.
Awesome. Good question, Bonnie. Thanks, Joe, for answering it. I have one more question. We are going to bring on Joan Lenny.
Thanks, Joe, for a great presentation. My dad was in advertising starting here in Chicago, and then he went to New York to be a madman. But he advertised Falstaff beer. And on the south side of Chicago, as you went on the Skyway, you used to see silos there with a great big painted Falstaff beer sign. I wondered if you ever saw it. I don't know what they're made out of. Silos, there were like 3 or 4 of them, and they had that logo.
I used to drive that way very much because my mother lived in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and I would head out. I would head out that way and end up getting on US 30 and driving into Fort Wayne. And I believe actually Falstaff had not when I was little, but later on had a brewery in Fort Wayne, because Fort Wayne had a large German population. And when I was little, there were 3 or 4 brands of beer there. And in fact, the original Mr. Berghoff from the Berghoff restaurant downtown came from Fort Wayne, Indiana. And when my brother and I used to be in preschool and high school and would caddy at the local country club, we would ride our bicycles past the Berghoff estate. Apparently they were some descendants of this same family, but I never took a picture of it. I remember seeing the brewery there, but that brand is it's not on the market. I don't know. It either eventually went out of business or got bought up by somebody else. I don't know what the fate was.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Joan. All right. Well, I think we have answered questions. Deb, did that bring up any other questions for you?
No, I think that's great. Anyone who wants to see the pictures can get the book at the book table or at Amazon. And we've had our first literature program of the year on Zoom. Yay.
Awesome. Well, I just want to thank Deb for putting this together. And of course, Joseph Marlin, if you want to pick up his book, Fading Ends of Chicago, he's given you plenty of resources to do that. And please, this is our second program of the season, and we have plenty more. So go to our website, www.19thcentury.org, to find out about more programs. If you want to help us keep putting on these amazing programs, you can always send a donation to us via our website as well. And for everyone at the 19th Century Charitable Association, we just want to wish you a great day and thank you so much for